Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Today we have a science show, and we're going to look at some deep questions like, what is reality? It is neither what you think, nor is it what you sense. It's weird, wild, and counterintuitive, and its inner workings seem at least as implausible as the idea that something can come from nothing. The landmark work of today's guest on Pathways explains the seemingly inexplicable with an absorbing, lively account of the greatest intellectual adventure in history, the creation of the scientific view of the universe at its most fundamental, where fact is stranger than fiction. Our guest is Lawrence Krauss, author of the new book, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. Why Are We Here? Lawrence is a renowned theoretical physicist, director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. He is the author of more than 300 scientific publications and 9 books, including some international bestsellers like A Universe from Nothing and The Physics of Star Trek. The recipient of numerous awards, Dr. Krauss is a regular columnist for newspapers and magazines, including The New Yorker, and he frequently appears on radio, television, and in feature films. Hello, Lawrence, and welcome to the Pathway Show.
Well, it's nice to be with you virtually.
Well, we're going to do the best we can via Skype today. Why did you decide to call the book The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far?
Well, it was, of course, a play on words, so based on the story, the Bible story that's been called the greatest story ever told, because this is a story of the real universe, and it's a story that keeps changing as we learn new things, unlike the Bible story. And I happen to think it's not only more interesting, but it has the virtue of actually being real.
And you point out that human stories about God pale in comparison to this real greatest story ever told.
The real reason is that the stuff that comes from our imagination is interesting, but the universe surprises us at every level. That's why the so far part is so important, because we keep getting surprised. The story becomes richer, not because we invent new and interesting things, but because nature keeps driving us to new and interesting things that we never would have imagined otherwise. So the story is far greater because of those surprises.
Now, in the epilogue of your book, you ask the question, why do we do science? And I think that's a good question to start with today.
Well, first of all, I think in some sense we're hardwired to want to do science because the we want to solve puzzles. And of course we also look for reasons for things. I think evolution has primed us for that to some extent, because if the leaves were rustling in the savannah in Africa, you could assume there was no reason. Or you could assume there might be a lion behind it or something, and then those people that didn't assume the lion didn't reproduce. So I think we're hardwired to want to look for reasons behind things, which is of course part of the reason people invented religions. But I think more interestingly, we like to solve puzzles, and we're all kind of born scientists. Kids are born scientists. They always want that's how we learn, by experiencing and experimenting, and the sad thing is that we tend to drive that interest out of kids in school. But if we preserved it, it would be great, because we should all be lifelong scientists, because it's an important part of growing and learning. And of course, it's also, as even though my story is relatively esoteric, I argue that since we were able to cut through the illusion of reality in physics down to the most fundamental levels, we should be doing the same thing and cutting through the illusion of reality that's done in politics, and the same kind of skeptical inquiry and empirical investigation that's driven us forward there can help in the real world as well.
Now, I suppose, therefore, you would maintain that curiosity itself has survival value.
Absolutely. If it didn't, I don't think we would be preserving it. But obviously, curiosity killed the cat too, at some level. But the point is that what's really an essential part of science is being willing to ask questions and go where the universe leads you, even if it leads you to where you don't want to go. And I think that for a lot of people, that's a problem. That's one of the reasons they're sort of afraid of science, is because they're worried it might affect their faith, for example. And instead, the universe is the way it is, and the brave effort to go where the universe takes us is one of the reasons why I called it the greatest story, because this intellectual journey that science has taken us on from Plato right through to the modern times is a brave story, because the universe isn't designed to make us happy, and being willing to go and find out sometimes that the universe is both wonderful and terrifying is a courageous effort.
I think this metaphor of science as a story, I mean, it's a story that's unfolding in real time, and you get that across so well in your book. But it's juxtaposed against stories that are kind of like chiseled in stone, literally, if not figuratively.
Yeah.
These belief-centric ideologies, these that deliver articles of faith that people don't dare question without, being potentially or figuratively burned at the stake. And the thing about science that's great is, in my view, and what you point out so well in this book, is that it encourages us to test our current beliefs, to treat our current beliefs as operating assumptions, rather than thinking that we're ever going to have the answers cast in stone.
Exactly. And I think that's what I'd like to encourage people to do, because that joy of discovery is fun for everyone. And I hope my book, by demonstrating how far we've come, especially in the last 40 or 50 years, in changing our view of reality to see how the universe is so different than we thought it was, that should amaze people. And it's part of the cultural heritage that we should all share. It's kind of saddens me that science seems so far removed from popular culture that people somehow seem to think you have to be a scientist to enjoy science, but you don't have to be a musician to enjoy music, or an artist to enjoy art. And science, you can enjoy without fully understanding all the details, just like you don't have to fully be able to unweave all the lines in a Bach cantata, all the different melodies that are going on in there. In science, of course, the more you understand, the more you can appreciate it, and that's one of the reasons why I write popular books, because I like people to understand more. But that joy of discovering that aha experience is contagious, and I think that science has the benefit of producing technology, of course, but more than that, it really changes our view of our place in the cosmos, and that's what the benefit of science is culturally, like art and music and literature.
Now, some people would argue that there's a new religion called scientism, and they would argue against what they would characterize as scientific reductionism, which they might accuse your old friend Christopher Hitchens of, or Stephen Dawkins and other famous atheists, of taking the position that if science can't measure it, or if science can't handle it, it basically is not real, or it's just fantasy if we can't get a grip on it. What would be your rebuttal to that? Because, I mean, are there not limits to logic, like what consciousness is, or how intuition works? Things we might understand someday, but that we don't understand now?
Well, of course, there are things we don't understand now. That's what science is based on. The fact that we don't understand everything, and we're happy to say I don't know, and let's find out. That's a key part of science. By the way, it isn't a part of religion. But I don't understand this term scientism, because sure, there are things we don't understand, but that doesn't mean we'll never understand them. It's the height of, of brashness, or the overconfidence, to say that just because that we know we'll never understand love or consciousness or anything like that, because it presumes that you understand it. I mean, how can you know you'll never understand it if you don't know enough to know? And so I think that science takes a very humble attitude, which is that we'll see what we can learn about the world. And right now, as far as we can see, there are no limits yet to what we've been able to understand. But it is true that the only way to understand the empirical world is to explore the empirical world. That means to ask questions and do tests and be willing to go where the empirical world takes you. Uh, revelation has never led to any knowledge. Okay, the inner work revelation that isn't related to any direct experience of the outside world. If you lock someone in a room without any experience of the outside world, they wouldn't come up with some beautiful description of reality. And if you want to call that scientism, you can, but all scientism is saying is that if you want to learn about the empirical world, you study it. And as far as we can tell, right now we haven't come up with the limits of that. And that it doesn't imply that things that aren't based on empirical reality aren't worthwhile in some sense, or that things that we can't understand aren't worthwhile. But it suggests that science, if it has physical existence, then science is the way to understand it.
Right. I guess what I think is meant by people who claim that science can become almost like a fundamentalist religion is the belief that some people hold that unless you can prove something scientifically, it's not worth thinking about, or it has no value.
Well, I don't know anyone who, I mean, I really don't know anyone that suggests that. But by the way, science doesn't prove things, it disproves things. And so I think that I don't know any scientists that, this claim is made that somehow that's viewed as all other things that are not sensible. But most scientists have a fine time under reading novels and listening to music and enjoying the sensory experiences that humans have. But they rightly argue that when it comes to explaining and understanding the world, then other ways other than exploring reality are largely false. So the notion that you can meditate and understand the world without any direct conscious experience of it is a kind of new age puff.
Well, but on the other hand, science has been informed by thought experiments
Well,
that.
of course, but those thought experiments are based on based on experience of the world. Einstein's thought experiments were based on his experience. That's what I'm saying. Of course, revelation, in the sense that you take what you see and then you think about it, and you might have an inspired idea. That's part of the creative process of science. That's wonderful, but at some level, you have to base it on reality.
Yeah, and ultimately, like his theory of relativity was mathematically borne out many years after he came up with it.
Yeah, but he based the relativity was based on scientific experiments. It was based on Maxwell and Faraday and Galileo, and it relied heavily on all of them. And without the discoveries of Michael Faraday, the electromagnetic discoveries of Michael Faraday, and later on coalesced into a theory by Maxwell, Einstein would never have come up with relativity. It wasn't some pure thought thing like some people suggest. It was based on trying to reconcile two different physics ideas that had been validated by experiment that were themselves inconsistent with each other. And it was brilliant that he didn't throw out either of them. He figured out a way to make them consistent.
Right.
And that's wonderful.
What do you think that before it was able to be mathematically proven that there was some faith operating? I mean, faith in his own common sense, faith in his intuition, faith in what made sense to him, sure, based on things he had learned or whatever, but in the absence of scientific proof, he had a confidence in his own intuition. It's not about revelation, but what is intuition?
Intuition is something we build up by our experience in the whole.
Right.
And of course, it was partly based on intuition, but it wasn't just based on intuition. It was based on the results of experiments, and it wasn't mathematically proven. Of course, his mathematics was proven by himself because the mathematics was consistent. It was in fact consistent almost immediately with the results of experiments by Michelson and Morley that showed you couldn't prove the Earth was moving in any way. It had an absolute motion, was impossible to measure, and there was a very famous experiment having to do with light that showed more or less the speed of light is the same in all directions, regardless of whether the Earth is moving or not. And Einstein was as closely tied to experiment as anyone could have been. He was not just basing the theory of relativity on intuition. And I spent a lot of time in my book talking about precisely about how Einstein's theory was built on trying to make consistent these wonderful discoveries of electromagnetism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then this amazing results of Galileo 2 centuries earlier on the nature of motion. He was Einstein was being a fundamental physicist in both relativity and when he helped develop quantum mechanics. All of his papers in 1905, and then even his theory of general relativity. And then it was only later on, when he started losing touch with experiment, that his ideas basically became less interesting.
Less interesting in the sense of becoming more philosophical or theoretical. I mean, I thought
No, less interesting in the sense that they didn't give any productive results that explained reality.
right. Do you think that's because he got older and the best scientists are young?
Well, I don't think it's the best scientists are young necessarily, but that often happens. But it requires new generations, as Max Planck once said. Physics proceeds one funeral at a time. Einstein. You're lucky if you're in touch with nature for a short time, and Einstein was beautifully in touch with nature. But then the physics moves on, and a new generation that's trained and learn and based their experience on new experiments and new knowledge are better prepared to be able to leap into the unknown and accept the results that may seem terrifying. As, for example, Einstein helped develop quantum mechanics, but he never fully accepted the reality of quantum mechanics, and spent a long time and much of his time sort of fighting the new understanding of the world via quantum mechanics. Plus, there were new discoveries of other forces. Einstein tried to unify electromagnetism and gravity, but by the 1930s, we knew of other forces, two other forces in nature, the weak force and the strong force. And a lot of my book is about how we've been able to understand them and unify them. And Einstein was so fixated on these earlier, on just electricity, magnetism, and gravity, that he didn't realize, it seems to me, in any case, that unifying those was not particularly interesting because they weren't the only forces in nature.
Uh-huh. You write in the book that Einstein was one of the first physicists to demonstrate that God does play with dice with the universe, which is so ironic considering his famous statement was that God doesn't play dice.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, Einstein helped develop the basis of quantum mechanics, which tells us that more or less um, the only way to determine the results of experiments is probability arguments. Um, but he never really, he always thought in some way that there was something more fundamental that would obviate that. And that's often the case. Max Planck, whose experiments and theory originally was the first developer of quantum mechanics, never bought the ideas of quantum mechanics. That's because quantum mechanics is so strange and non-intuitive. It seems to defy common sense. It does defy common sense, but as my friend Richard Dawkins has argued, common sense once again was developed on the savannah of Africa, so our early hominid ancestors would survive, and it wasn't developed to understand quantum mechanics.
Now, obviously, the title of your book illustrates that you're co-opting a traditionally religious theme and reimagining it in scientific terms, this greatest story ever told. But you go beyond that. I mean, the three parts of your book are titled Genesis, Exodus, and Revelation. So why did you...
Well, again, if I was, and I think the point is that people are familiar with that book, that story, and give it some and give it some credence. And I wanted to point out how we live in the 21st century. We don't live in the the second century BC, and the world is different. And that old explanation of how it works, which really wasn't an explanation at all, it is okay. But why not instead of celebrating that as having some fundamental truth, why don't we celebrate the truth of the world that we've really discovered?
Right. Why do you think we're having such a regressive, that there's so much clinging to these Stone Age dogma from 2,000 or more years ago? How can this be? I mean, we went through the Renaissance, we went through the 19th and 20th centuries of incredible scientific discoveries. Why are we so dead set on clinging to ideologies?
Well, I think it's Look, I think part of it is that, well, part of it is that we force it upon kids. It's really hard to overcome these things that are forced upon you when you're a child. And it's hard to break out of that. And I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we give it a kind of, in society, we give it a kind of credibility that it isn't due. We make it seem like if you question these cherished notions, you're somehow an awful person. And people, pretty well everyone questions this stuff, even the people that call themselves religious, but they don't want to do it in public because it's viewed as in poor taste, which is
Right.
unfortunate because we're allowed to question everything else about the world, and in a democracy, everything should be open to question, and in fact, we should encourage questioning. We should encourage kids to question everything. It's the way to make progress in the world.
I've often marveled at the fact that the Bible is referred to as the good book. I mean,
Yeah.
as you point out, it's it's inconsistent and outdated, and you say one might legitimately argue that as a guide for human behavior, large swaths of it border on the obscene. And this isn't even to refer to things like slavery and uh, human torture and all the other
And killing your children if they disobey, or
right.
raping women. The Bible, which is claimed to be this moral document, is a pretty immoral document. If you take it literally. Now the difference is most people today don't take it literally. They did a millennium ago, and it produced terrible results. And you see the same thing in people taking the Quran literally, which is also equally violent. And so the problem with taking these ancient books literally is that you're driven to act in a way that may have seemed appropriate in the year 600, but isn't appropriate in a world that we live in today. And uh, uh, but nevertheless, to say that is somehow offensive to people. When I say something like that, people say, "How dare you offend me?" And I say, "I'm not trying to offend you. I'm not trying to. I'm not. It's not a comment on you. It's a comment on the books."
Right.
Right.
Right. Well, when you grow up in this closed system where if you even doubt what you're taught, that's a sin and that's the devil tempting you, there's so much fear behind that. I mean, it just strikes me as incredible that people who are in the public eye as, purporting to be great intellectuals or pundits can believe in so many of the myths of the Bible, and will never even question it. I could name some names, but there's so many of them. It blows my mind that there's no respect for unfolding discovery, which is the story that you're telling in this book.
Well, it's a shame. I think some people are afraid of it. Once again, that it'll somehow force them to change their minds, and it does that. But that's the wonderful thing. The wonderful thing about the story is it changes, and we're forced out of our comfort zone. But that's what's called learning and progress in society, and it's unfortunate that learning and progress is cast in a way that either people are afraid of it or think of as somehow evil. And Yeah, and the story should be celebrated, and that's why I wrote this book. It's a story that is truly amazing, and I hate to use the term mind blowing because that's the term people use for these kind of things, but it is mind blowing because it you'd never come up with these ideas, and physicists didn't come up with these ideas because they liked them. They came up with them because nature forced it upon us.
I wish we had a lot more time because this is a fascinating discussion and we're hardly getting into the content of the book, which is this story. So if you could just summarize the book for us in the couple minutes we have left, that would be great.
Well, okay. Well, the book is really about uh, the revolution. It's really follows on my last book, which is The Universe from Nothing, which was about the revolutions in our understanding of the universe on its larger scales. And this is really the story of understanding the universe on its small scales, the fundamental structures that that uh, and forces that make the universe work. So after the universe was created, once why does the something that is in our universe look the way it does? And what it describes is this amazing story that has dead ends and wrong turns and human passions and all the rest, but somehow the science carries us kicking and screaming, even because the scientists themselves are people, takes us to this view that the universe we see is really an illusion, that the fundamental aspects of the universe that seem like it's designed for us are really not that way at all at fundamental scales, that the particles that make us up, that appear to have mass, that can make up people and planets and stars and galaxies, that's only because some field froze in some configuration in the early history of the universe, and if it had frozen differently, we wouldn't be here. We're this remarkable accident, and that's okay. It's like people who might have grown up on an icicle or an ice crystal on a window, pointing in a certain direction, would somehow think that direction was special, but it's an accident, and ice crystals can point in many directions, and so to understanding how myopic our experience is really what this book is about, and how the scientists step by step came there, and ultimately to present the real picture we have and the implications for the future. That the future may not be so rosy in the long term, but that's okay. We should enjoy our brief moment in the sun.
Now, as you pointed out in a December New Yorker column, you accused the Trump administration of waging a war on science. We've only got about a minute left. What advice would you give to our listeners?
Well, to demand evidence and resist claims that don't rely on empirical evidence, or that distort or misrepresent or ignore the results of science. And most of what the Trump administration describes, from economics to security to climate change to energy, is based on claims that simply don't have any basis in reality. And until we are willing to create public policy that's based in reality, we're going to produce public policy that's dangerous and doesn't help any of us. So don't accept results uncritically, and resist policies that are in the long run don't agree with reality, because reality, as I often say, has a way of coming back and biting you in the butt. And in the long term, reality is that which continues to exist even when you stop believing in it. We better base our policies on that, or our children or our children's children are going to suffer.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Krauss. I'd love to talk longer, but we have run out of time. And before we go, I want to tell our listeners about your website and spell the address for them, because it's based on your name, Lawrence Krauss, Krauss, and the website is krauss.faculty.asu.edu.
Yeah, I'm at Arizona State University, so it's Krauss, my last name, .faculty.asu for Arizona State University.edu, and you can find a lot of stuff there. And my Twitter handle is lkrauss1.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you.
It's a fascinating book, and we'd need a couple more hours to really get into the contents of it. It's a very great story. It is the greatest story ever told.
I hope so.
And
I hope
at least so far.
So far, exactly. That's the best part.
And for those who tuned in late today, this is your Pathways host, Paul O'Brien, author of Great Decisions, Perfect Timing, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. In a second, I'll tell you how you can rewind and replay this interview anytime you like via the internet or as a free podcast. Just search for Pathways or Paul O'Brien and you will find it. Today we've been visiting with Dr. Lawrence Krauss, author of The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, Why We Are Here. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Pathways program, which is broadcast and streamed worldwide via KBOO.FM Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. USA Pacific Time. Podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com, spelled D-I-V-I, nation.com, as well as via iTunes and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways and podcasts. Thanks again to Lawrence Krauss and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways experience.